When it comes to high IQ crime films, they have always been the kind of stories audiences never get tired of. So today, I am bringing you a little-known Korean mystery thriller that has been called the Korean version of Detective Chinatown, The Accidental Detective. It tells the story of a bizarre case packed with one twist after another, constant turning points, and enough mind games to keep your nerves on edge. So without further delay, let us get straight into the film. The story begins with a full-time stay-at-home dad named Kang Dae-man. His daily life revolves around watching over a small shop stacked with detective novels and taking care of his daughter. That day, he finally snapped after enduring a life without a single day off, and simply decided to walk away from it all for a while. After leaving his daughter with his wife when she got off work, he went out and drank heavily with an old friend he had known for years. When he woke up the next morning with a splitting headache, he realized that he had spent the night at Kim Yong-gyo's house. The moment he saw the dozens of missed calls from his wife, Dae-man instantly knew something was wrong. But just as he was about to leave, he heard Kim Yong-gyo's child crying non-stop with no one around to comfort her. Out of curiosity, he stepped into the bedroom to see what was going on, only to find Kim Yong-gyo's wife lying motionless on the bed in a pool of blood. It did not take long for the police to arrive and seal off the scene. After the investigation began, they confirmed that the female victim was Han Seo-young, a real estate agent in Seoul who usually kept a low profile, rarely made enemies, had a close relationship with her husband Kim Yong-gyo, and shared an adorable young daughter with him. Yet this very woman had been brutally killed at around 10:30 the previous night. From the fact that the killer had struck multiple fatal areas and kept going until she lost too much blood, it seemed clear that there had been deep hostility between the two. Otherwise, the attack would not have been carried out in such an extreme way. The detective in charge of the case, No Tae-soo, carefully examined the crime scene and immediately ordered his subordinates to investigate the victim's husband Kim Yong-gyo thoroughly and without missing a detail. After years of solving cases and building up a wealth of experience, he had always believed in one unchanging rule when it came to murder investigations.
아내가 죽으면 그 범인은 바로 남편이다, 자식아.
But as the investigation continued, the police discovered that the victim's husband actually had a very strong alibi witness, and that witness was Dae-man himself. Because the two of them had been drinking together the night before, he simply could not believe that Kim Yong-gyo, who had been drunk out of his mind, could have harmed his own wife. Although the police found no evidence during questioning, No Tae-soo still placed Kim Yong-gyo at the top of the suspect list. At the police station, there was also an officer named Jun-soo, who had been close friends with both Kim Yong-gyo and Kang Dae-man for more than 10 years. Ever since learning that Han Seo-young had died, his mood had been extremely low, as if he were hiding something he could not bring himself to say. Looking at his devastated friend Kim Yong-gyo, he could only offer a few words of comfort. Not long after that, the medical examiner gave No Tae-soo a very useful clue. Based on the angle of the wounds, the killer appeared to have used the left hand, but judging from the shape, size, and force of the injuries, the person did not seem to be a true left-hander. So why would the killer deliberately do that? There was another strange detail as well. The watch the victim usually wore had no blood on its face, but there were quite a few bloodstains on the back, making it seem as though the killer had intentionally removed the watch during the attack and smashed it. And the time where the hands had stopped was less than 5 minutes away from the time of death determined by the coroner. No one knew what the killer's purpose was in doing that, but based on the restaurant owner's statement, Kang Dae-man and Kim Yong-gyo had been out drinking during the estimated time of the attack. That directly ruled out the husband as the one who committed the crime. With no other choice, the police continued investigating Han Seo-young's personal relationships and financial activity, and this time, they really did uncover a lead. Just a few days before her death, Han Seo-young had withdrawn 150 million won in cash from the bank. That was no small amount of money, so the police followed the financial trail, and in the end discovered that Han Seo-young had used that money to purchase an apartment. But in an unexpected twist, the property registration showed that the owner of the apartment was actually the police officer Jun-soo. What made things even more suspicious was that Jun-soo was also left-handed, which fit the profile of the killer even better. Most importantly, the police found the murder weapon near the victim's home, and it just happened to have Jun-soo's fingerprints on it. So within only a few days, the police had built a powerful chain of evidence pointing straight at Jun-soo as the killer. And faced with all of this, Junsu had no way to explain himself. Even though No Tae-soo trusted Junsu's character and conduct, he still found himself powerless in the face of such solid evidence. But with all his experience, he could not shake the feeling that everything was just a little too convenient. In order to help his most capable subordinate, No Tae-soo decided to ask his superiors to reopen the investigation. However, eager to close the case as quickly as possible, the higher-ups immediately finalized Junsu as the culprit. So No Tae-soo, who had long been dissatisfied with this kind of unspoken internal system, ended up in a fierce argument with his superior. In the end, he had no choice but to make a bold bet with his boss. If within 15 days he still could not find evidence proving Junsu's innocence, or show that someone else was responsible, then he would pack up and walk away from the police station where he had worked for more than 10 years. And just like that, the agreement was made. At the same time, as Junsu's close friend, Tae-man was also deeply worried about his situation, especially after casually chatting with his wife. He unexpectedly learned that the owner of a nearby bakery had seen a suspicious man lingering downstairs from Kim Yong-gyu's building before the incident. Although the police had also received this lead, they did not seem to take it seriously. So the very next day, Tae-man went straight to the bakery to ask about it himself. And by pure coincidence, he ran into No Tae-soo there. No Tae-soo knew that Tae-man was Junsu's close friend, but seeing someone who was not even a police officer pretending to investigate the case on his own still irritated him greatly. According to the bakery owner, after closing the shop on the night of the incident, she was on her way back to the apartment complex when she saw a heavily built stranger standing right outside Han Seo-yeon's home. At first, she thought it was odd, but she did not think too much about it. But 15 minutes later, she realized that she had left her phone at the store, so she turned back to retrieve it. On her way back, she saw that the man had not left at all, and was now sitting inside a black car, staring fixedly at Han Seo-yeon's balcony. Since the bakery owner was a warm-hearted person, and because the man's behavior felt so unusual, she wisely noted down his license plate number and gave it to Tae-man and No Tae-soo on the spot. For them, this was an unexpected breakthrough, because No Tae-soo was practically working alone now, and the higher-ups had forbidden any other officers from getting involved in the case. So with no better option, he reluctantly accepted Tae-man, who clung to the case like a stubborn shadow, and the two of them awkwardly formed a low-key detective team. After that, No Tae-soo quietly asked a colleague at the station to run the plate number, and they soon confirmed the true identity of the car owner. Following the lead, the two quickly found a man named Jang Ho. From his account, they learned that 1 year earlier, Han Seo-yeon, who worked in real estate, had purchased a piece of land from him at a low price. But not long after the sale, the government released a new development plan for the area where that land was located. Just like that, a piece of land that had once seemed worthless suddenly multiplied several times in value. That was exactly why Jang Ho had remained bitter about it ever since. He believed that Han Seo-yeon must have known inside information, so he often went to confront her about it. But Han Seo-yeon always avoided seeing him, and the day of the incident was no exception. At first, Jang Ho rang the bell at Han Seo-yeon's home, but no one answered, so he went back to his car and waited for her to return. Later, growing impatient from the long wait, Jang Ho finally drove away and went to spend time with his young and attractive girlfriend, but he vaguely remembered that during the time he had been waiting, he had seen two figures appear on Han Seo-yeon's balcony. He could not make out their faces, but judging from their build and posture, they seemed to be two men. Since Jang Ho had left Han Seo-yeon's house at around 10 o'clock that night, and highway traffic camera footage confirmed that he had driven away during that time window, No Tae-soo quickly ruled him out as a suspect. But Jang Ho's statement that he had seen two figures before the victim came home made No Tae-soo suspect that the killer had very likely entered the house in advance and waited there. Right after that, No Tae-soo and Tae-man went together to visit Junsu, who was being held in detention, because just the fact that the married Han Seo-yeon had used years of savings to buy an apartment for Junsu was enough to make anyone's imagination run wild. Junsu explained that over the past few years, Kim Yong-gyu had piled up huge debts because of his gambling habit. Even though both he and Han Seo-yeon had helped Kim Yong-gyu pay back a large amount, Kim Yong-gyu still refused to change his ways. As time went on, Kim Yong-gyu ended up owing a great deal of money to loan sharks to protect the future of her family of 3. Han Seo-yeon had no choice but to use her savings to buy an apartment under Jinsu's name. That way, the money could be preserved instead of being taken by debt collectors. And even if their current home was seized, the family would not end up drifting from place to place with nowhere stable to live. Because Junsu was dependable, trustworthy, and loyal, Han Seo-yeon placed great faith in him and entrusted him with this responsibility. Of course, Han Seo-yeon had told Junsu not to tell Kim Yong-gyu about it for the time being. However, Junsu did meet her on the night of the incident, but only to discuss the paperwork related to the apartment purchase. After they finished talking, Han Seo-yeon got into a taxi and left in a hurry, and no one could have imagined that she would later die in her own home that same night. Just as No Tae-soo and Dae-man were scrambling to clear Jinsu's name, another married middle-aged woman in the same apartment complex was suddenly found dead under highly unusual circumstances. The way she died was even more shocking, and the victim was none other than the wife of Detective Ma, a colleague who worked at the same police station as No Tae-soo. The moment Detective Ma learned that his wife had been killed, he was overcome with grief, and in front of everyone, he let out a cry of absolute despair. Veteran investigator No Tae-soo arrived at the scene and, after conducting a careful examination, came to the conclusion that this case had likely involved 2 killers. First, one of them had hidden near the garage that Detective Ma's wife usually passed through, and the moment she appeared, he struck a vital area with a sharp weapon. Then he joined forces with the second killer to drag Detective Ma's wife into the kiln of the pottery studio she had run while she was alive, and burn the body there. What made it even more disturbing was that before setting the body on fire, the killers had used Detective Ma's wife's phone to record the exact time of her death. At first glance, Han Seo-yeon and Detective Ma's wife seemed to have nothing to do with each other, but from the way the killer handled the details of both crimes, the similarities were striking. First, both women lived in the same apartment complex and both had families. And second, the killer deliberately left behind a clear death time in each case, whether it was the stopped watch on Han Seo-yeon's wrist or the time captured on Detective Ma's wife's phone. The moment this came up, Dae-man suddenly remembered another case from a few months earlier near Seoul. A foreign woman who worked at a nightclub had clearly died by drowning, yet her body had been found in an extremely strange place, right beside the road. When Dae-man first read the report, he had been deeply puzzled by the killer's unusual move. But now, linking it with these 2 new cases, he came to a startling conclusion. The killer had probably gone to all that trouble because he wanted the police to determine the nightclub woman's time of death as accurately as possible, which was why he drowned her first, then moved her body to the roadside so it would be discovered by passers-by. Because if the victim had remained underwater for too long, it would have seriously interfered with the coroner's ability to determine the exact time of death. So the question became, why was the killer so obsessed with the police establishing the victim's time of death so precisely? And who would benefit from that? What was certain was that once a highly precise time of death was established, anyone with an alibi during that time could be ruled out, even if they were the primary suspect. Thinking back to No Tae-soo's long-held rule from years of casework, that when a wife is killed, the husband is usually the one behind it. And combining that with the fact that both Kim Yong-gyu and Detective Ma had solid alibis in these 2 recent cases, No Tae-soo and Dae-man decided to link all 3 seemingly unrelated murder cases together and investigate them as one, peeling back the layers bit by bit to uncover the truth underneath. So the 2 of them began looking into the drowning case from a few months earlier. To their surprise, they discovered that when the police found the nightclub woman's body, they had also found another woman's body nearby. For the sake of keeping things clear, we will simply refer to the second victim as Woman A. What made it even stranger was that Woman A had been strangled to death with the strap of the nightclub woman's bag. At the time, the police had concluded that the nightclub woman had strangled Woman A with the bag strap, then ended her own life out of guilt. But that theory obviously made no sense at all. After all, how could someone who had already died by jumping into the river possibly pull her own body back out of the water and move it to the roadside? Dae-man believed that when the killer was attacking the nightclub woman, Woman A had accidentally passed by and witnessed what happened, so the killer decided to silence her as well and eliminate the loose end. As No Tae-soo reviewed the case files from the drowning case, he uncovered another crucial piece of evidence. The police had found a strand of hair on woman A's body. DNA testing showed that it belonged to a man named Lee Yuno, a robber with a criminal record. But in the end, because the evidence was not strong enough, and because Lee Yuno had no known social connection to either the nightclub woman or woman A, the police dropped the charges against him. But this Lee Yuno was no ordinary man. 5 years earlier, he had been sentenced to 7 years in prison for breaking into a home, committing robbery, and injuring someone. Yet for reasons no one could clearly explain, he had been released after serving only 3 years. What made the story even more unsettling was that the person who had testified against Lee Yuno back then was a female college student who lived across from the victim's home. It was her testimony that had allowed the court to convict Lee Yuno so quickly. Because of that, Lee Yuno had always held a deep grudge against the college student who had pointed him out in court. And not long after Lee Yuno was released from prison, that very college student died under extremely suspicious circumstances. Even though Lee Yuno had a very clear motive to do it, he also had a strong and reliable alibi at the exact time she was killed. As a result, the college student's death also became a cold case that remained unsolved. Looking at the connections so far, the 5 female victims seemed unrelated on the surface, but several of them still had varying degrees of connection to Detective Ma and Lee Yuno. On top of that, No Tae-soo also discovered that the officer who had arrested Lee Yuno back then was none other than Detective Ma. Although the two appeared to stand on opposite sides as cop and criminal, that still did not rule out the possibility that they might have been secretly working together behind the scenes, especially since Lee Yuno had originally been sentenced to 7 years, yet walked free after only 3, which strongly suggested that Detective Ma may have quietly helped make that happen. At the same time, Detective Ma's wife's murder case suddenly produced a new suspect. That man was a fitness coach who had been very close to Detective Ma's wife. The police found traces of Detective Ma's wife's blood on a bicycle chain he had recently changed out, so they suspected that he was the killer. But under police questioning, the fitness coach insisted that he was innocent. He said that Detective Ma's wife was simply a client he got along with, and that he had absolutely no reason to kill her. However, while explaining himself, the fitness coach suddenly brought up Detective Ma, the victim's husband. He claimed that Detective Ma's wife had often complained to him about her husband, saying that he was petty, vicious, and small-minded, and that about half a year earlier, he had even been tricked out of a large sum of money by a foreign woman who worked at a nightclub, and that the marriage between the two had been far from peaceful. The moment it looked like the man was shifting suspicion onto him, Detective Ma completely lost his temper, stormed in, and beat him violently. But when No Tae-soo saw this, he caught an important detail. The victim in the drowning case was also a woman who had worked at a nightclub. Could there be some kind of link between the two? In order to connect all of these clues as quickly as possible, No Tae-soo and Dae-man decided to use Lee Yuno as their breakthrough point and focus the investigation on him first. After several days of searching, they finally learned through back-channel information that Lee Yuno was hiding in a warehouse near the industrial district, so the two rushed there at once. Strangely, the moment No Tae-soo and Dae-man arrived at the warehouse, the place, which had been eerily silent, was suddenly pierced by the shrill sound of a ringing phone. Following the sound, No Tae-soo moved toward the only passage across the reservoir, trying to locate where the phone was coming from, but that move nearly cost him his life. The instant No Tae-soo stepped into the water, Lee Yuno, who had been hiding in the shadows, immediately pulled the switch. Fortunately, No Tae-soo still had the instincts of a seasoned veteran, and reacted in time by leaping up and grabbing the railing above him, narrowly escaping disaster. It turned out that Lee Yuno had somehow learned about their plan in advance, and had installed a 500 kilovolt high-voltage line in the reservoir, intending to kill both No Tae-soo and Dae-man the moment they arrived. Luckily, the two of them survived in the end. After this incident, No Tae-soo and Dae-man became even more certain that Lee Yuno was directly connected to these cases, and aside from people inside the police station, almost no one on the outside knew they were investigating Lee Yuno. From that, the two concluded that the person tipping Lee Yuno off had to be a mole inside the station, and the most likely person was Detective Ma. From there, Dae-man began piecing it together. In the two murder cases from a few months earlier, Lee Yuno had an alibi when the female college student who testified against him in the home invasion case was killed. and Detective Ma also had an alibi when the nightclub woman who had swindled him was killed. There was a strong possibility that the two had secretly carried out a murder swap plan. Detective Ma killed the college student for Lee Yuno, and in return, Lee Yuno got rid of the nightclub woman for Detective Ma. Only that would explain how both of them could have such solid alibis. The only complication was that while killing the nightclub woman, Lee Yuno never expected to be seen by woman A, who just happened to pass by, so he decided to silence her as well. And because Han Seo-yeon lived in the same apartment complex as Detective Ma, her death may have happened because she accidentally discovered the connection between Detective Ma and Lee Yuno, and was eliminated for it. Then, Detective Ma, who had already crossed too many lines, had long been at odds with his wife, and after suspecting that she and the fitness coach were involved, he set things up for Lee Yuno to personally carry out the killing of Detective Ma's wife. However, the evidence from the scene of Detective Ma's wife's death clearly showed that there had been two killers, while Detective Ma himself still had a solid alibi, which meant this little murder team likely had a third member. But who could that third person be? The only clue was that traces of blood from a man with AB blood type had been found on Detective Ma's wife's teeth. But among all the suspects they had investigated, including Detective Ma himself, not a single one had AB blood type. And with that, the case became even more confusing. A few days later, No Tae-soo received another tip. Lee Yuno was attending a cosplay convention at a park in Seoul. Although No Tae-soo and Daeman gave it everything they had and still failed to catch the slippery Lee Yuno, they made an unexpected discovery. 1 month earlier, Lee Yuno had once again become a high-priority target for police surveillance after being suspected in another theft case, and an electronic ankle monitor had already been placed on him. That meant every move Lee Yuno had made over the past month had been tracked by the police. Following that lead, No Tae-soo and Daeman immediately headed to the police monitoring center in Seoul. They were thrilled at the thought that if the record showed Lee Yuno had entered the scenes at the times Han Seo-yeon and Detective Ma's wife were killed, then he would undoubtedly be one of the murderers. But the result of the investigation caught everyone off guard. The monitoring data showed that although Lee Yuno had appeared in the apartment complex where both women lived at the time of the incidents, the GPS records did not show him entering either victim's home, which meant that at most, he had only been watching the area, not personally killing Han Seo-yeon or Detective Ma's wife. And that made the whole thing even stranger, because during the time Detective Ma's wife was killed, Detective Ma had deliberately been on duty at the station to create an alibi and remove suspicion from himself. Now the evidence also showed that Lee Yuno had never entered the murder scene, so if neither of them had gone in, then who were the two people who killed Han Seo-yeon and Detective Ma's wife? At that point, the case seemed to have hit a wall with no way forward, but time was running out, and soon the 15-day deadline No Tae-soo had agreed to with his superior arrived. That meant not only would No Tae-soo have to pack up and leave, but Jun-soo would also be convicted by the Korean prosecution for premeditated murder. In court, Jun-soo kept insisting that he had been framed, but No Tae-soo and Daeman still could not find the evidence needed to prove his innocence. And just like that, in the first trial, Jun-soo was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The moment he heard the verdict, Jun-soo felt as though he had been struck by lightning. He let out a desperate cry, shouting about his innocence and his anger at the injustice of the legal system. Seeing that scene, No Tae-soo and Daeman could only stand silently in the corner. Even No Tae-soo's superior chose that moment to mock him for his failure. But instead of crushing them, the ridicule only pushed the two of them harder. Daeman, who had spent years reading detective novels, suddenly came up with a bold new theory after thinking it through again and again. As mentioned earlier, the police had found blood from a man with AB blood type on Detective Ma's wife's teeth. If Detective Ma could turn a criminal like Lee Yuno into a partner in murder, then it was very possible that he had also picked out others among the suspects he had once arrested, people who shared the same twisted mindset, and slowly turned them into members of a murder swap team. And while going through the information No Tae-soo had gathered, Daeman found a man named Han Tae-won, a controlling and violent individual. At the same time, he was also the only AB blood type male among the criminals Detective Ma had arrested. Han Tae-won had repeatedly accused his wife of still being involved with her ex-husband, and had beaten her because of it. Although his wife had reported Han Tae-won to the police many times and asked for help because of his abuse, every case had eventually gone nowhere. That also explained why the police found blood from a man with AB blood type on Detective Ma's wife's teeth, yet could not identify him through the system, because under the legal system at that time, DNA from people whose cases had never officially been filed, or from those with certain criminal histories, had not been fully entered into the database. By coincidence, Han Tae-wong had once again been brought into the station by Detective Ma over the past 2 days, and was currently being held in detention, and tonight happened to be the final night of Han Tae-wong's detention, so Dae-man made a bold prediction: unless something unexpected happened, Han Tae-wong's wife would be the next victim tonight. In detective fiction, murder swapping is one of the oldest tricks in the book. For example, A, D, and C each have someone they desperately want dead, but if those people really end up dead, the police would naturally see A, D, and C as the prime suspects. But what if they joined forces and killed for one another? For example, if AB kills C's wife, BC kills A's wife, and AC kills B's wife, then when all 3 women die, each husband still has an alibi and can avoid suspicion. But Dae-man had only ever seen this kind of murder trick in novels. Even though Tae-soo felt that pulling off 3 highly calculated and extremely difficult murders like this in real life was almost beyond belief. And even if Dae-man's deduction was the truth, who exactly were A, D, and C? On top of that, there were still too many loose ends in the theory, too many holes that did not fully hold up under scrutiny, to keep Dae-man from getting pulled in any deeper. No, Tae-soo drove him away and told him to stay out of it. Yet after being forced out of the car, Dae-man did not give up. Instead, he went alone to the area near Han Tae-wong's house, planning to look for Han Tae-wong's wife. To his surprise, he happened to see the woman just as she was about to leave. It turned out that not long before this, the killer had stolen her ex-husband's phone and, pretending to be him, sent her a message asking her to meet up somewhere. The woman did not suspect a thing and quickly headed to the place mentioned in the text. Seeing that she had not noticed him, Dae-man could only follow from a distance, tailing her all the way to a golf course on the outskirts of town. By then, the golf course was already closed, and the entire area was wrapped in darkness. Just as Dae-man was about to search for Han Tae-wong's wife, he suddenly heard the sound of someone falling behind him. When he turned around, he realized it was Han Tae-wong's wife. It was clear that someone had already been lying in wait for her, though thankfully she had not died on the spot. But just as Dae-man rushed forward to help, 2 killers stepped out from the shadows, and the moment Dae-man saw their faces, it hit him like a bolt from the blue. One of them was indeed the cold-blooded Detective Ma, but the other was none other than his longtime friend, Kim Yong-gyu. The truth was that after Lee Yuno was placed under electronic monitoring, Detective Ma could no longer use him freely, so in order to keep his plan moving, he had to find a new partner for his murder swap scheme. Around that same time, he happened to notice that Junsu had been meeting Han Seo-yeon again and again, and because they all lived in the same apartment complex, Detective Ma recognized that the woman Junsu kept meeting was a married neighbor, so he took the photos he had secretly snapped and went to Kim Yong-gyu's butcher shop, where he deliberately began sowing distrust between husband and wife. As it happened, Kim Yong-gyu had already started noticing changes in Han Seo-yeon. She had become secretive, and her phone kept lighting up with calls and messages every day. Once suspicion takes root in someone's heart, it does not take long before it begins to grow. Then one day, Kim Yong-gyu saw with his own eyes that Han Seo-yeon and Junsu were entering and leaving a housing office together, and even handling property paperwork side by side. At that moment, rage completely took over, and he decided to accept Detective Ma's offer and join the murder swap team. On the night of the first case, Detective Ma and Han Tae-wong lay in wait at Kim Yong-gyu and Han Seo-yeon's home. The moment Han Seo-yeon returned, they caught her off guard and violently ended her life. Meanwhile, Kim Yong-gyu deliberately used Dae-man to secure himself a time witness. After the two drank themselves into a stupor, Kim Yong-gyu took Dae-man back to the house, knowing Dae-man was too afraid of being scolded by his wife to leave on his own. That was how Kim Yong-gyu successfully removed suspicion from himself and his wife's death. Right after that, Han Tae-wong and Kim Yong-gyu, now both with blood on their hands, lay in wait for Detective Ma's wife. After taking her life, they even photographed the moment of her death, making sure the police would have a precise time to work with. That was why Detective Ma, who was working late at the station during that time, was able to successfully clear himself of suspicion in his wife's death, and tonight, Detective Ma had brought Kim Yong-gyu with him to kill Han Tae-woong's wife. Although the sharp-eyed Dayman caught them in the act, he was no match for the two men. With no other choice, he revealed to Kim Yong-gyu the truth he had learned from Jun-soo, hoping that somewhere deep down, it might still awaken a shred of conscience in him. And the moment Kim Yong-gyu learned the truth, he completely fell apart. It turned out that from the very beginning, all of this had been part of Detective Ma's careful manipulation. Just as Dayman was about to be killed, Kim Yong-gyu tried to step in and stop it, only to be shot down by Detective Ma. But at that critical moment, No Tae-soo arrived in time and shot Detective Ma dead. And just like that, this gripping and incredibly complicated serial murder case was finally solved. Before long, the case drew massive attention from the public and the media, causing an enormous uproar. The story of three husbands swapping murders to kill each other's wives became headline news across newspapers and the internet. The good news was that Jun-soo was finally cleared of all charges and walked free. And after cracking the case, No Tae-soo earned major recognition for his work, winning the respect of the top brass at the Seoul Police Department, while the superior who had always oppressed him was finally thrown out for good, which was deeply satisfying to watch. At the same time, Kang Dae-man was awarded the Good Citizen Prize by the government for his role in uncovering the truth. But after everything that had happened, No Tae-soo had become completely disillusioned with the incompetence and inaction within the police system, and decided to retire early. He planned to join forces with Dae-man, whose instincts were razor-sharp and whose mind for deduction was exceptional, and together they would open an elite detective agency of their own. And with that, the film comes to an end.